In these negotiations, we have not reached a point for a final agreement, but I can say that to reach this goal of an agreement, we have taken steps forward. Where we are today looks very different to 3 months ago. It's even more different to 6 months ago. The negotiating positions held by Iran and the P5+1 have come closer together, and many of the points of disagreement have gone away.
Decisions need to be made. Flexibility needs to be shown by all sides. But I believe that we can in fact reach a solution that will change the course of relations and would change the general picture of our region and beyond.
These talks aren't going to suddenly get easier just because we extend them. They're tough, and they've been tough, and they're going to stay tough. But in these last days in Vienna, we have made real and substantial progress, and we have seen new ideas surface.
We're all focused on trying to get to a deal, but I wouldn't want to give any false hopes here. We're still quite a long way apart, and there are some very tough and complex issues to deal with, but we're all focused right now on trying to get that deal done.
Well, Iran and the P5+1 group of countries have extended a deadline for a deal over Tehran's nuclear energy program by 7 months. The 6 world powers want Iran to curb its nuclear program in exchange for a lifting of economic sanctions. Now, both the US and Iran say that they are confident a deal can be reached, but that some differences do remain. Well, to discuss where we go from here, let's turn to our guests for the evening. In the studio, I'm joined by political analyst Ross Fitzgerald. Ross, welcome back to the show.
Hi.
Then we jump over to Tehran. We have Mustafa Khusheshem. He's also a political analyst. And in Boston, Jim Walsh, a research associate at MIT. A warm welcome to all of you, gentlemen. Ross, if I can begin with you, is an extension of that deadline the best thing for these negotiations?
It's not a surprise. I think, to be honest, asking anybody in the last few weeks, though there seems to be a ramp up in talks and a closening of positions from what we'd heard from briefings, that in itself was a surprise. No one had expected, I put it this way, a month ago no one expected anything but an extension of these talks. In the last couple of weeks there seemed to be increased optimism that we might be arriving closer to a solution. But it's gone back to where we were before. It's no surprise that we've gone for the extension now.
Yeah, but Mustafa, what does the extension say in Tehran specifically? Does it spell out success or failure?
Well, in the name of God, hello, and thank you very much for inviting me to the program. It differs from, different perspectives. Everybody is approaching this result of the talks from his own perspectives. Some believe that according to what Mr. Zarif and Mr. Rouhani and Araqchi and others have said, there is a window of opportunity still open, and the differences have been narrowed down, and the two sides are more likely to strike a deal in the near future, or maybe in 4 months or a maximum 7 months. But there are others who believe that no matter what's happening inside the talks, the United States has proved already several times, all throughout the last 3 decades, especially since the Afghanistan invasion by the United States, that the United States is not a trustworthy partner in any kind of deal or negotiations, and it has proved it, especially with regard to Iran. And I am a proponent of this second theory. There are many reasons for that. If you get back to our little agreement with the United States when it invaded Afghanistan.
Okay, Mustafa, let me stop you right there, because I do want to get into some of those reasons a little bit later on in the program. Right now, I want to bring Jim into the discussion here. Jim, going back to what this extension actually means, we have the Iranian President Sheikh Hassan Rouhani saying that there's a big difference between where we were 3 to 6 months ago and where we are today. Do you agree with that assessment?
Everything I've heard from the negotiating teams, I've spoken with team members from 3 of the different countries in the talks, suggest that there has been progress. Everyone says that people are serious and they're trying to reach a deal. It may have been expected, this extension. I think most analysts expected it, but that doesn't mean it's good news. On the one hand, it's good that they're continuing to talk. The Joint Plan of Action, the interim agreement, has been a success. The International Atomic Energy Agency issued a report the day of the conclusion of that round of talks saying that all the parties are following their obligations. But I really wonder whether we're missing a historic opportunity here. I worry, in 6 months, does Obama come back stronger politically? Does President Rouhani come back stronger politically? What is the state of the U.S.-Russian relationship 6 months from now, or events in the region? There are lots of ways and lots of things that could happen where the opponents to this deal, hardliners in all the countries, take advantage of this extension to try to undermine the talk. So I worry about this. I hope this wasn't a missed opportunity.
Yeah, and the geopolitical realities of the globe are certainly changing quite quickly. Now, we should point out that the content of those negotiations is, of course, being kept classified. But what we do know is that we now have 2 deadlines. We have March the 1st, that's for a framework agreement. And then we have July 1st, that's for a comprehensive and final agreement. Now, there are remaining points of contention, of course. We have the number of centrifuges which Iran is allowed to operate. We have the duration of the deal. Iran wants somewhere between 5 years, and the U.S. wants 10 years and over. And then we have, of course, the lifting of sanctions, one of the most contentious issues of all. Iran wants all of these sanctions, the EU, US, and UN sanctions lifted immediately, whereas the US wants a more gradual lifting of that embargo. Ross, if I can come over to you now, because as far as I understand it, there is a principal understanding between the P5+1 and Iran when it comes to Tehran's nuclear energy program. But there are these technicalities which need to be hammered out. Why is that taking so long if we have this principal understanding?
Well, it's something that the French Foreign Minister Laurent Fabius said coming out of these talks, that there were technical assessments required for new ideas that were arising. Now, the new ideas, basically what this comes down to is the inherent sort of dual nature of these talks. These are political talks on technical issues. So we are seeing politicians lock themselves in a room in Vienna, but they're discussing things that their expertise over is quite limited and is extremely complex. Anytime a politically viable or potentially politically viable idea is floated, all sides need to go away and find a technical assessment of whether it's practically feasible. So it sounds like, although you're right to note that the content of these negotiations are classified, so we don't know exactly what's going on in the room. It really does sound like that's at least the line which is being chosen by those from the P5+1 coming out of this, certainly, that this is what we've got. We've got closer political discussions, but it depends on the viability of many of the ideas which are being floated. It's also been said that in the last few days before the closing of this round of these negotiations, that there were new ideas or new possibilities that only came up in the last few days. That was a quote that came from at least 2 of the foreign ministers involved. So it may be that something quite specific required technical assessment back from each party.
Yeah, but these are political discussions, Jim. As Ross pointed out, there is the West using the nuclear issue to try and pressure Tehran on its foreign policy and its domestic policy as well.
Yeah, I would say no on that. The nuclear negotiations are not a lever to accomplish other goals. In fact, I'd say it's almost the opposite. The U.S., Iran, and others at the table would like to have discussions about regional issues, whether it's the stability of Iraq, ISIL, the future of Afghanistan. There are a lot of things where interests may not be identical, but where they're shared, and discussions would be useful to try to manage these problems. But they can't do that until they get a nuclear deal. I think all the negotiating teams are focused on the nuclear deal with the hope that done, other things will be possible. I'm also going to disagree with Ross on this, on the degree to which this is driven technically versus politically. He's certainly right to say that that's what the negotiators are saying at their press conferences, but I don't really read it that way. In fact, I think in some cases the negotiators have been mesmerized by technical issues obsessed with number of centrifuges or particular details, when really this is fundamentally a political agreement, and breakout time, which is you often hear discussed, is really not the driver, should not be the driver here. And the real issue is there a deal on the table? I think there's a deal on the table already. The question is not the technical details, it's whether there's political will for all sides to seize that opportunity. I think we have the outlines of an agreement more or less in hand already. It's just that people don't want to make the difficult decisions.
But I mean, my reading of it is very much that a successful outcome for either of the parties involved, or for different parties within the P5+1 perhaps, could come down to a technical misread by the other side, and that's where I think the technical side comes into it. I mean, obviously it's a political, obviously this is a political agreement which they're trying to reach. But if one side underestimates the capabilities of the other, let's say the P5+1 underestimate the technical capabilities of Iran to break out because they haven't properly assessed some of the criteria which have been agreed to at this stage, then Iran can perfectly legitimately say down the line, we're going along with our agreement, and yet we're achieving something which you would never have wanted us to achieve. So, I mean, there's different arguments, and I'm I'll shock you by saying I'm not a nuclear scientist, so I can't really speak on the matter of, of how many centrifuges it would take, or whether a new design of centrifuges, etc. I agree, obviously, that Jim absolutely is right that this is fundamentally a political agreement, and that that it will be political drivers ultimately which lead to either the breakdown of the talks or ultimately a final agreement being reached. But it's just one of those that if a T isn't crossed or an I isn't dotted, if someone hasn't checked that could be the undoing, or that could be the one side feeling that it lost in the 6 months, a year, 10 years from now, that they got these negotiations wrong because they didn't go back and check.
Okay, Mustafa, speaking of the political agreement, earlier you said that there was a lack of trust between Tehran and Washington in specific. Do you think that the West is trying to exert pressure on Iran to change things about its foreign policy using the nuclear issue?
Yes, of course. See, the political will that your other guest mentioned, that's correct. Here in Tehran, we have already proved that we are very much compliant with our commitments and undertakings, and this means we are resolved and we have the needed political resolve to settle this issue. We have complied with the terms that mentioned in the Geneva Interim Agreement, and according to the latest IAEA report, in diluting our 20% enriched uranium, we are even one step ahead of the program. That's number one. The problem, I have a couple of examples to prove that, is that the United States is not willing to resolve its problem with Tehran. Remember that during these talks, before the July the 20th, the last deadline, if you remember, 6 months ago, something like that, the United States started its excessive demands to include Iran's missile technology and then again Iran's human rights conditions into the talks, so that they will have new pretexts. If the nuclear problem is resolved, then they will have other pretexts to exert pressure on Tehran. Of course, Tehran did not accept that, and all Iranian officials stressed that this is their red line, and they are only willing to talk about the nuclear issue and nothing else. But again, if you look at previous agreements that Iran has had with the United States, Iran has complied with the terms with its end of the bargain, like in the Afghanistan invasion by the United States. But the United States did not comply with its undertakings. With regard to Iraq under Saddam Hussein, if you remember, Iran fulfilled its undertakings. But the United States, what did they do? Number one, George Bush came out and said Iran is the main part of the axis of evil. That was the response and the reward, and that was the undertaking, was that? And number two, they invaded our consulate in Erbil, and they arrested 4 or 5 of our diplomats. So what was the agreement? Was the agreement like this? Never. There have been many other cases similar to these that the United States has proved.
Okay, Mustafa, let me stop you right there, because I have a feeling that Jim has a few things to say about some of the points you made there. Jim, go ahead, jump in.
Well, I think Mustafa is right to say that there's a long history of mutual justified mistrust of the parties. Let me remind everyone, this is an international negotiation. It's not a U.S.-Iran negotiation, even though those are the two principal parties. Obviously, the people of the talks include Britain, Germany, France, Russia, China. So this is an international negotiation.
Yeah, but it's fair to say that if the Americans and the Iranians
I do not accept that. I do not accept that. If I can add something, this is not true. This is not true because many European parties last year, they told the Iranian negotiators that if you want to resolve your problem, we don't have much problem with you. You got to resolve your problem with the United States and not us. And that's why Iran started direct talks to the United States. And the leader allowed, the Iranian leader allowed them to start direct talks with the United States. This proves that the main problem is from the United States, and because the United States is not willing to resolve the problem, I'll give you more examples during the recent talks in Vienna.
Let's give Jim a chance. Let's give Jim a chance to jump in and make his point. Go ahead, Jim.
Yeah. So I don't like being interrupted. Let's be clear about that. I think it's impolite, and I don't interrupt other people.
Well, to be fair, the content of the show, Jim, is that people are allowed to speak over each other to make their point, but everybody will be given their chance. Go ahead, Jim.
I look forward to that. That would be awesome. So there are lots of things here that are wrong. Let me start with what I think he gets right. I think there are lots of reasons for both sides to distrust each other. It's been a difficult relationship, and they're both justified. I could list a long litany of complaints the U.S. has about Iran. That's not going to accomplish anything. Let me point out also that it's just incorrect to say that the Europeans are all on board with Iran. France clearly is not. There's a reason why John Kerry visited France before going to Vienna, and that's because the French have been a problem. And, you know, if you want to take the line that there's mistrust here and an agreement's impossible, well, great. But I think that's really not revealed in what's happened over the past year. It's a foolish way to think because it puts us on a path towards collision where no alternatives, no diplomatic alternatives are possible. I know the negotiators personally in most of the countries. And I can tell you that all the sides are trying to get this done. They face political constraints. And as for the U.S. introducing the missiles and human rights things, that's just factually incorrect. The missile issue was unfortunately, I might add, unfortunately, in the UN Security Council resolutions. You can read them. The text is online. And so I think wisely, all the parties have chosen to sort of push that off to the side because that's an extraneous issue that could kill the talks. The U.S. has not brought human rights in and has repeatedly said the focus is nuclear, nuclear, nuclear.
Yeah, and Mustafa, the Iranian delegation has also made that point on a number of occasions, that they do want to keep all of the other issues separate here.
Wait, let me add something to this. Your guest, from the United States, Jim, I believe.
Yes.
He is trying to say this is mutual mistrust. This is not mutual mistrust. I'm talking about the agreements that the United States had with Iran. I'm stating this very clearly, Iran has complied with its undertakings in the last decade in the few agreements that it has had with the United States. But the United States has not complied with its undertakings. Look at the Geneva Agreement. One of the terms of the Geneva Agreement was supplying Tehran with safety spare parts for passenger planes. And the United States did not do that until just last month. It had to start doing so several months before that. But they didn't do anything. They repaired the engine outside Iran. I do accept that. But they did not supply spare parts for the safety parts of passenger planes. We are not talking about military planes. This is another case. During the talks, during the experts' talks, another case happened. Since the beginning, they have been saying, the Americans have been saying that if you want to guarantee that we should not have any more concerns about your enrichment program, you should dismantle it, you should decrease the number of your centrifuges. Every time that there is a technical problem, the Iranian scientists work out a problem, they take it to the talks, they present the United States with their solution in order to guarantee that Iran's civilian nuclear program will never go towards military goals. And the Americans are convinced, then they raise another question about the nuclear issue. Then they want to have another excuse to force Iran to dismantle its nuclear program or its enrichment program. Then again,
okay, Mustafa, let me stop you right there because I do want to bring Ross. I want to bring Ross into the discussion for a moment here.
They never present us with solutions.
Right, Ross. That point there in particular. I mean, it's never been proven that Iran's nuclear energy program has been anything but peaceful. Report after report by the IAEA has also shown that Iran has complied with its obligations, its end of the deal.
Well, and that's to be commended, absolutely. That doesn't in any way, we're talking about statecraft here and we're talking about geopolitics. Just because a state has acted in accordance with its multilateral agreements over the last 12 years, or 10 years, or 8 years, or 6 years, doesn't mean that the rest of the world simply says, well, fair enough, we'll leave you to go on your way. I mean, it requires the
well, why not? I mean, that is the essence of giving Iran its
well, because
right
because
to
well, for
nuclear
one reason, in
enrichment.
that period, President Ahmadinejad said that he wanted to see Israel wiped off the map. I mean, when you're making statements like that, with your national leaders making statements like that, and at the same time you're asking everyone just to leave you to your own business. But by the way, in pursuit of civilian nuclear aims, you're going to be potentially within a breakout of a few months of having a nuclear weapon to actually make something like that a reality, then obviously it's going to make the rest of the world a little cagey. So that's not a huge surprise, and I don't think that should be taken as anything other than just the rest of the world doing its job.
Mustafa, do you agree
Can I
with
jump
that?
in on there?
Yeah, go ahead, Jim, jump in.
Yeah, I would disagree with the way you characterized it. The IAEA has, in its monthly reports, once quarterly, now monthly, said that there's no evidence that Iran has diverted material from its declared facilities. That part is true. It's also said that all the parties have lived up to their agreements, at least the nuclear parts, in the Joint Plan of Action. That's true. It is not true to say that IAEA has not expressed reservations about Iran's program. That is simply not true. That's why there's a whole parallel investigation into what's called possible military dimensions. And Amano has continued to complain that Iran has not addressed these outstanding
Okay, but it is
issues.
fair to say that there's been never any evidence provided to suggest that this is anything but a civilian program.
No, that's not true. That's not true. Iran admits that it took, illicitly, took a weapons design, a Chinese weapon design, as well as the plans for how to build an IR-1, which is really a Pakistani centrifuge, from AQ Khan. They admitted that a long time ago. And frankly, I think all parties have done a great job with the Joint Plan of Action, but skeptics would look at Iran's nuclear behavior, and I know they take a different view, but the majority seems to take the view, at least on the Security Council and at IAEA, that Iran was not complying with its 3.1 modified code piece of its safeguards because it did not announce Fordo and it did not announce Natanz in advance, and it passed the additional protocol and then stopped abiding by it. So I think there are some issues, but we can, as I say, everyone can throw stones at each other all you want. I think there are reasons for mutual suspicion on both sides, and remember, there are 7 parties to these talks. But I do think the most important thing is that they're solvable, and we should stop focusing on the past. And admit that there are legitimate suspicions that both sides need to address, and then move forward with an agreement that puts us in a different path.
But actually,
Wait a minute, I have something to add in here. We are not here to misinform the people. When we talk about the information, we had better be very much precise. Number one, to refute all your guests' allegations about Iran's program, the NIE report, National Intelligence Estimate of the United States, twice in 2007, 2010, they stressed that Iran has not been after a military goal in its nuclear program, at least after 2003. Former IAEA Director General Mohammad al-Baradei had raised 6 ambiguities about Iran's nuclear program, and through an action plan, they were all resolved. And the IAEA Director General Mohammad al-Baradei then, he endorsed that all the 6 ambiguities have been removed and have been resolved about Iran's past activities in its nuclear sector. So this means that Iran has never been moving after a military goal in the past and in future. Number 2, about the 3.1 that Jim is talking about, let me add something. See, there is an old version, there is a new version. According to the old version, whenever you build a facility like Fordo or whatever it is, or Natanz, you don't have to announce it. I'm talking about the old version. That you don't have to announce it to the IAEA unless you are 3 months before injecting gas into your centrifuge machines. That's the old version. And when Iran announced it to the IAEA, 1 year before injecting gas into the centrifuge machines, Iran announced it. So 9 months ahead of the program. Iran then had not signed, like many other countries, it had not signed the 3.1 version, the new version of the safeguards. And as soon as it signed the 3.1 version, it complied with all its terms and all its undertakings. So this is the point. This is the problem with the Americans. They want us to fulfill what they want, not our international undertakings. They want us to give in to their excessive demands. If we do this today, they will ask us tomorrow. Like one of the main senators who was behind the crude sanctions against Iran, he was interviewed. This could be searched through the internet very easily. Last spring, not this spring, spring of 2013. He was asked in an interview, what would happen if your nuclear problem with Iran is resolved? He said, nothing will happen. We will impose and keep the sanctions in place for Iran's missile technology. He was asked, what happens if you resolve your missile technology problem with Iran? He said, we will maintain the sanctions regime against Iran for its human rights issues. And he was asked the last time, how long are you going to keep these sanctions in place? He said, until one of these two things happens. One, the Islamic Republic regime is toppled, or it changes in nature the way that it's not going to block our path and be a threat to our interests in that part of the world. That's the main problem. The United States does not want to accept that Iran is an independent regional actor and power.
Okay,
yes,
Mustafa, let me stop you right there. Let me stop you right there. Let's broaden that discussion a little bit concerning sanctions. Ross, we have those sanctions being wrapped up despite that interim Geneva agreement, which was reached last year. Now we have a hostile Republican Senate, which is about to come into power. What happens next?
This fits into the wider discussion. I think what we've found ourselves the last maybe 5 minutes of discussion, and it's typical of the discussion over the past few months, the last at least year of talking about these negotiations on details. And I'm, as I said a moment ago, I think the details are incredibly important in all of this. But taking a step back and taking kind of a macro view, one way to characterize this is that you at the moment have two sort of key political actors in the head of the US government and the head of the Iranian government who can trust each other. So potentially forget about what's been done in the past by these states and start looking at the people with the power to make decisions on behalf of these nations at the moment. And there is certainly a degree of trust between at least the people at the top, that is Kerry and Zarif. Now that's important because what they're doing now arguably is from a position of trust, from a position of strength with one another, putting in place a system, a framework that will hold and be of value to both sides going down the line if either country elects or finds themselves with a leader who doesn't have trust or doesn't have the trust of the other party.
Yeah, but there are a number of parties. There are a number of parties in these talks that wield quite a bit of influence that are not part of these talks. Excuse me, Jim. I want to bring you in on that, talking about external actors. The Israelis, for instance, screaming against the deal. We know that the Saudis and other Persian Gulf states don't want one. How much pressure is that exerting on preventing a deal from being reached?
Well, I think it's in the back of the minds of the negotiators, but it's not primary. You'll remember that Netanyahu came out before the joint plan of action was officially announced a year ago and said it was the worst thing in the world and it was Munich and blah, blah, blah. That didn't stop the joint plan of action from being implemented. And now a year later, he's in favor of extending it. So I think where it plays out is in U.S. domestic politics. Mustafa mentioned the senator who had all the regime change views. I think that's part of it. I have to remind Mustafa, though, that a U.S. Senator is not the President of the United States. And I'm sure I could find people in the Majlis who would say things that were equally unhelpful. In the U.S. system, it's the President, not a Senator, that runs U.S. foreign policy.
But could it be even a lame duck president like Obama looking at a Republican Senate?
I think the challenge here will be, if they don't get an agreement soon, the new Senate will pass a new sanctions bill whose purpose will be to undermine the negotiations. At least a lot of the people voting for it will do that with that intention. Then I think it'll be vetoed by President Obama, and the question will be, will he have enough votes in the Senate to sustain a veto and stop that action? That's a question that we don't know the answer to. I think he could, but it's guesswork at this point. He would be in a much stronger position. This is why I think another reason why Mustafa is wrong. I think both Iran and the U.S. would prefer to have an agreement as soon as possible, because each day that passes, it becomes more difficult. So I think if there is an agreement, the political advantage shifts to the president, and Congress will find it very hard to kill the deal, and Israel will find it very hard to do it because it won't want to risk politically isolating itself. Let me just conclude. I thought it was when Mustafa was saying that there were no bomb activities and all the rest in Iran, and he cites, ironically, strangely, the 2007 NIE, and he says since 2003. He characterized it exactly right. What he forgot to tell you was that same NIE says Iran did have a bomb program from the late 1990s and then halted it in 2003. I personally think that there seems to be a lot to support that. And I think that's probably true. So when people in the U.S. say Iran has a bomb program, I say no, they do not have a bomb program. They've not made that decision, and they haven't had a program since 2003. But there was stuff in the past, so it's not unreasonable for people to be nervous about that.
Mustafa, your response?
Well, whatever Jim says reminds me of Mr. Netanyahu. You all know that Netanyahu has been telling that Iran is 6 months away from producing a nuclear bomb. He has been saying this for the last, as far as I know, for the last 10, 15 years. And they are
we've been hearing
talking about
for many
the
years from a
breakout
lot
time,
of
and they
different,
say Iran is at least 6 months to 12 months away from producing a bomb. And they have been saying this every time they talk about Iran. That's number one. Number two, about the senators that you said. Everybody, I believe, at least this is what how the United States is trying to portray itself in the world, that at least with regard to Iran and its nuclear issue, this is the Congress and the Senate, they have the upper hand. Why? Because number one, the senator that I said, he was the sponsor of the crude sanctions against Iran that came into effect. And Iran is right now under those sanctions. That's number one. Number two, just about the last week, or even, I don't know, 4 or 5 days ago, when the negotiators were still in Vienna talking about the deal, we all remember that the Congress had said that Obama cannot remove, at least a major part of the senators had said that Obama cannot remove the sanctions that the Congress has passed, or the ones that have been, especially according to them, the harmful ones to Iran. These should be decided by the Congress. The same day that we're talking about the Iran's nuclear issue in Vienna on the 23rd of November, one of the senators took a bill to the floor which demanded sanctions against Iran, tough sanctions against Iran, but this time for human rights issues. This had a message for Obama, for Iran, and everyone, that if you resolve your problems with Iran with regard to the nuclear issue and you want to remove the sanctions, we have the same sanctions to be imposed against Iran under on another pretext. That's number one. That's the first message. This message has been so strong that some people in Tehran, some commentators and some officials, have been saying that maybe we are wrong to be negotiating with the U.S. administration. We should go talk to the U.S. Congress. That's another point which is risen very recently. Why? Because the United States cannot resolve its problem domestically. Remember, in the Geneva deal, whenever it talks about the EU, it says EU. whenever it talks about Iran, it says Iran. That means the whole ruling system of Iran. But whenever it talks about the United States, it mentions the US administration. It never says the United States. It never says the whole ruling system. It says the US administration. This means Obama doesn't have the power much, or enough at least, for fulfilling the deal that he wants to strike with Iran. And I do predict that this is not going to be resolved unless the United States changes its foreign policy outlook. I do believe that if the United States changes its foreign policy outlook and accept that Iran is an independent regional power, then there will be shared interest that they can be each other's partners for many regional issues, and they can both benefit. But the United States is not willing. Why? Because most of the senators, we all know, this is not a secret, most of them are dependent on campaign donations, and the money comes from the Zionists, from the Israeli lobbies, from IPAC, and they have to satisfy the Israelis.
All right, Jim, go ahead. Go ahead,
Zionists.
jump in. Let me stop you right there,
right,
Mustafa. Go ahead, Jim.
Yeah. So, a couple of things. First of all, I don't understand Mustafa's overall position. Is he saying he's against the talks because the Americans will never do what he wants them to do? In other words, he's anti-negotiation. When I said that he cited a source, the NIE, that source that he cited said Iran had a bomb program. It had stopped in 2003. His answer was, "Oh, Jim, you remind me of Netanyahu predicting that Iran will have a bomb in 6 months." I never said that. I don't, and that's certainly not an answer to the point that that the source he cites says Iran did have a bomb program and then shut it down. Now, I think the whole Zionist thing is way out of bounds. There's definitely true that groups that are pro-Israel are active on Capitol Hill, but they are not all defining. And again, you don't really understand the American system. The center of gravity in foreign policy is in the executive. Congress has the power of the purse to alter funding, but it's very hard for Congress to be the president, especially since there are 535 of them, and to set foreign policy. In fact, when an APAC supported bill emerged last December, 1 month after the Joint Plan of Action was first created in last November, in December there were a group of Congress people who tried to pass sanctions and kill the bill. What happened? That was defeated. So, I think you need to learn more about the American system. Do I think that there are senators
Jim, just sort of,
would love to pass?
Okay, Jim, let me stop you right there because Ross wants to get a word in. Let me stop you right there. Go ahead.
But it's simply to mirror the fact. I think we're all very used to discussions about the sort of sclerotic political system in the US and the difficulty of negotiating with the US, knowing that even in any given 4-year period or 2-year period of stable administration, you've got positioning for the next 2 years following on. So for that reason, because it's a very vibrant democracy with very open sort of discord amongst the mainstream players, it's very easy to then see the flaws of negotiating with that position. A lot of the time, you just have to do that on faith. There's a lot less discussion about the sort of Iranian equivalent. That it's not true that the US is the only party with domestic politics here. Iran has domestic politics, and I think that. For the US, this is a political decision. There are pros to getting the deal, and there are political pros, and there are cons to getting a deal done, and there are political cons. With Iran, it's slightly different, and it's a slightly more subtle, more difficult to diagnose from the outside because it is a more closed-off system. What you see more is that the description here is there's a political risk in Iran to getting the deal done because there's been so much investment in putting themselves in opposition to this deal and to the parties who are being negotiated with. But there is an economic risk in not getting the deal done. And at the moment, what's probably going on behind the scenes, again, it's very opaque, but what's probably going on behind the scenes in Iran is a cost-benefit analysis. Do the economic benefits of doing a deal with this P5+1 group do those economic benefits outweigh the political costs from having been set up in opposition to them for so long and invested so much domestic political capital in undermining these people who would now be your negotiating or your agreement partners?
Okay, Mustafa, I know that you want to disagree with some of that there, but for the sake of moving things along, let's assume that we are moving towards some sort of an agreement here. Could this be the foundation on which the US, the West, finds common ground with Iran over other issues, for instance, Iraq and Syria?
Yes, of course. Just one sentence before that. Let me tell you, from the supreme leader, Ayatollah Sayyid Ali Khamenei, to everybody else, to people, everyone is supporting the president and Mr. Zarif and the negotiating team. But there is a part who say that we support you, but we know that the United States is not a trustworthy partner and this will lead to nowhere. But this does not mean that we do not support the negotiating team. That was the leader who said, I'm pessimistic, but I fully support the negotiating team. That's number one. Number two, yes, if the United States eventually comes after 35 years to develop this notion that Iran is independent, is a power in the region, and it acts independently according to its own interests and not for the sake of the United States or West's interests, then they can define certain, at least in certain areas, they can define specific areas of cooperation. They can work in a much better atmosphere. There will be more trust, according to Jim, mutual trust. And we will have a better world, yes. But my point is one. This is the United States that should stop its excessive demands. This is not what I say. This is what Mrs. Zarif and all the Iranian team has repeatedly stressed, and the United States has never rejected this point of the Iranian negotiating team to say that we have not raised any excessive demands. No, they are raising excessive demands and they should stop it. As soon as they stop it, we will have a deal and everything will be much better and we will have a better world.
Okay, on that optimistic note, gentlemen, I'm afraid that we have run out of time this evening. I want to thank all of my guests in the studio, Ross Fitzgerald from Tehran, Mustafa Khosheshem, and in Boston, Jim Walsh. Thank you all very much for being here tonight, and thank you very much for watching. Don't forget, you can catch us again at the same time next week. Goodbye for now.